Welcome to Up Close, the research, opinion and analysis podcast from the University of Melbourne, Australia.
I'm Jennfier Cook. Thanks for joining us. The word diaspora comes from the Greek diaspora and means to scatter seeds. And it's this journey to new lands and a longing to return home that seems to capture something so essential to the human condition. Today, the word is used to capture any form of a real or imagined community situated far from its cultural, linguistic or genetic origins. In this episode of Up Close, we're going to examine the Chinese diaspora and ask what the emigration of more than 37 million Chinese people tells us about China itself and the markets people have made in all regions of the world outside the Middle Kingdom. Also, we ask what are the feelings towards China among the so-called overseas Chinese. Joining us in the studio to help us answer these questions is Professor Pookong Kee, Director, Asia Institute here at the University of Melbourne. Kee, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, Kee, I'd like to ask you, what is a diaspora and what are some of the essential characteristics?
Well, diaspora historically was a problematic concept in that for a long time the word was associated with the Jewish experience, the forced dispersion of members of the Jewish group, and for a long time the longing to return. In more recent times, the concept was associated with the African slavery experience. And for a long period of time, Americans of African background were basically deprived of any links to their homeland. And from the 1960s, one started to see a popular culture developing in North America that tells the story of the African dispersion and literature about, longing for the homeland and so on and so forth. But increasingly, the concept has become rather loose in its usage. And now one, hears about, for instance, gay diaspora, soccer diaspora, and so on and so forth. And in my personal view, the less disciplined use of the term, unfortunately, loses the academic and the intellectual, meaning of the concept.
So there's different kinds of diasporas, but the Chinese diaspora, that's essentially a migratory one, isn't it?
In the case of the Chinese, it was mostly migration and often, voluntary migration. And comparable stories would be the Italians, the Greeks, the Indians, and perhaps, to some extent, the Japanese and the Koreans.
So let's just talk about how big the Chinese diaspora is. And the figures we have are from 2003 of 37 million, with 80% of them being from Southeast Asia. Now, it could be much bigger than that, couldn't it?
It could be much bigger than that. It depends on how one defines a diaspora. It's often, one gets into political debates as to whether one should consider Hong Kong and Taiwan be part of the Chinese diasporas. If we were to include Taiwan and Hong Kong, the commonly cited figure is well over 50 million. If not, perhaps about 35 million Chinese are overseas, meaning Chinese outside of mainland China, Hong Kong, and Macau and Taiwan.
So can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Chinese diaspora? Well, it begins as far back as the 15th century, doesn't it?
It did. Chinese emigration started probably, in significant numbers from the 15th, 16th century. And in the early days, they were mostly trader migration. But large-scale emigration only started towards the later half of the 19th century, and in particular the first half of the 20th century. And the emigration was mostly labor migration, where millions of Chinese left mostly southern China, going mostly to Southeast Asia. And it is in Southeast Asia where about 80% of the Chinese outside of China are now located.
And From 1882, we have the Chinese Exclusion Act in the US. In 1901, we have the White Australia Policy. And 1923, the Chinese Immigration Act in Canada. So there's efforts to limit Chinese immigration.
There was. And as a result, we find that the overwhelming majority of Chinese are located in Southeast Asia, partly because of the Western attempts to stop or to reduce the number of Chinese arriving in the respective Western countries. And this is an interesting contrast with other diaspora groups, and a comparable one is perhaps the Indians, where their members are more widely scattered. In contrast, the Chinese are very much in Southeast Asia and remain so.
I was going to ask you, what can studying the Chinese diaspora teach us and why it's important, but talking to you now, it comes down to this very basic thing of being human and talking about who we want, who we don't want, where we live, where our home is.
Mm-hmm.
And you can see with these Western countries sort of shutting the gates and others opening the gates, it can teach us a lot.
It does, and I think perhaps the best way to learn about it is how a group of people who had to emigrate under circumstances of adversity, poverty mainly, has ended up, being seen as a global asset that, members of the Chinese diaspora, having been scattered in different parts of the world and over time have been successful in different walks of life, are now very much part of the globalization or perhaps regionalization process. And what was seen as an experience of adversity is increasingly regarded as an asset, not just for the Chinese themselves, but for international trade, for international relations, and for international linkages.
Yes, you do talk about diasporas having a special relevance in a globalised world, this global production networks, the Chinese Commonwealth, and the benefits of it.
Yes, the term the Chinese Commonwealth was coined by a psychiatrist at Harvard University, Professor John Cao, to suggest how the Chinese in different parts of the world, perhaps unintentionally, have become a very well-connected network, not just in production, but in the distribution of our goods and services, and also in the ability to understand the international market. And he coined the term, the Chinese Commonwealth. It's a term that, Chinese scholars themselves are a little bit, worried about because the modern history of our Chinese international migration has been that there has been a considerable amount of suspicion about the Chinese minority, in particular in Southeast Asia, and to talk about, a Commonwealth as if it's a group that has a certain, vested interests has been somewhat of a problematic concept. In a period when nation-states were important, when, nations and states were jealous about, their own interests, having, to think about such a global network was at times seen as a national threat. But increasingly with regionalization and globalization, such a network is regarded as a national and international asset.
Fascinating how words become so loaded, how they're always so loaded. Now, Kee, you talk about reversing the 3 Ds of migration. What are they and what does it mean?
Often when one learns about migration, the 3 Ds is a good shorthand of the migration experience. The need to migrate, essentially poverty or political, instability. And most of the migrants are ended up working in 3D jobs. 3 Ds standing for dirty, dangerous, and demanding. But international organizations, including the United Nations, in recent times have been trying to turn the 3 Ds into a more positive way. The 3 positive Ds of our migration is migration contributing to the democratization process, Migration, of course, are contributing to development through remittances and so on and so forth. And in places like, Japan, Singapore, the more developed, economies and societies, migration is a way of redressing the demographic imbalance. Meaning, in cases where women are not marrying or women are not, reproducing, migration is a way of, overcoming that demographic deficit.
This is Up Close, coming to you from the University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm Jennfier Cook, and our guest today is Professor Pookong Kee, and we're talking about the Chinese diaspora. Kee, can you tell us a bit about this so-called informal Chinese women's liberation movement in the late 19th and early 20th century? What I mean is there were many women who chose not to marry and they left their homes in southern China to seek a new life in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. Now, many worked as domestic servants, known in Singapore and Malaysia as ama, or black and whites, meaning their black trousers and white blouses. And some ended up as labourers, the Samsui women in Singapore and Malaysia. What about this aspect of the diaspora?
The liberation is perhaps, the downstream effect rather than the reason for them, emigrating. They emigrated out of sheer poverty. And most of the women who emigrated, initially to places like Hong Kong, nearby places, and subsequently to more remote destinations, mostly Southeast Asia, were women, from very poor families, from, villages that were, struggling to survive. The common occupations that they ended up in were working as, housemaids in homes of, wealthy families. And a small group, in the case of Southeast Asia, ended up in construction sites, hard labor work. In the case of one particular group, often referred to as the Samsui women, who ended up working mostly in Singapore and Malaysia. The Samsui women, the word Samsui comes from the Chinese, meaning 3 rivers. And they basically came from, that part of Guangdong province in southern China, where 3 rivers meet. And when they were working in construction sites in Singapore, the women were distinctive in that their dress was always black in color. And square cloth hats that they wear is always in red. And because many of them were very poor, they could not afford to buy, proper shoes. And what they often did was they made their shoes or sandals out of old tires. And really, a group of very hardworking women whose aim in life is to save as much money as possible in order to send back to China to help, their families back in China. Many, of course, died without children, and their welfare was basically something that members, they look after each other.
Almost like soldiers or sisters in arms. It's almost like a warrior ethos.
There's even a claim that they would take a pledge among themselves that they would not get married in their lifetime. And when they get old and in times of need, it's the sisterhood that, provided the help to them. That, generation of our women migrants has basically, disappeared. And increasingly, there is a greater recognition of their contribution. And in Singapore, for example, a small museum has recently been set up to commemorate the very important contribution of the Samsui women to the early development of Singapore. The other interesting aspect about the early women immigrants and how they contributed to the migration experience is this recent observation that if one were to think about international migration now, there's a very, very distinct, feminization of international migration, meaning that, in places like, Southeast Asia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Malaysia, you are seeing, a large number of women migrants who either, worked in homes as domestic helpers or who work as nurses in hospitals, who work in different areas of our industry. But, historically, with the Chinese migration experience, women have always played a very important part. It's not just a recent, phenomenon.
Kee, could you talk to us a bit about Singapore and the fascinating situation we have there where the Chinese are the majority ethnic group, but there's a schism within that group, isn't it, for those who have received Western education and those who have had a Chinese education?
Yes, the Chinese experience in Singapore is very interesting and some would say, rather ironic in that this is the only country outside of China that has a majority Chinese population. Just over 70% of Singapore's population could trace a Chinese ancestry. And yet in Singapore's modern history, there has always been somewhat of a tension between what used to be described as the Chinese educated and the English educated, or rather, people who are Chinese in their thinking, in their ideology, and Chinese who have received a Western education and who either by, religion or by, ideological inclination identify with the West. Some would argue that dichotomy in Singapore political history has continued. But if it does, if the dichotomy, if the tension continues, I think it has been greatly, eroded by the rise of China. The fact that, Singapore as a relatively small, society, as a small country, is very much exposed to China, and Singapore's economic well-being is very, closely linked to its economic interest with China. As a result, the historical divide between the Chinese educated and the British or English educated has somewhat been eroded. But many would argue the differences remain. I, as a social scientist, cannot help but being amazed by how in the popular media one only has to read the Straits Times, the main newspaper, English newspaper in Singapore. They would refer to, for instance, new immigrants from mainland China who have come to work in Singapore as China girls, China men, China whatever, which, as a social scientist, we have a long time ago learned to avoid because of the negative stereotypes associated with those terms.
You're listening to Up Close, coming to you from the University of Melbourne, Australia. I'm Jennfier Cook, and we're talking about the Chinese diaspora, and we're joined by Professor Pookong Kee. Now, there are some that say there are question marks around the loyalty to China among overseas Chinese and the Chinese diaspora as seen by others. We've got the so-called fifth column phenomenon. Is it real or imagined? What is it and how has this affected integration into new countries?
In the case of the Chinese diaspora experience, more so with the Chinese than perhaps with the other transnational groups, there has always been, I think, some political doubts about their loyalty. And the Chinese experience has been accentuated by China's own political development that, China in 1949 became communist. And then the whole Chinese diaspora experience got caught up in the Cold War ideology. And that, in Southeast Asia, where over 80% of the overseas Chinese are located, many of the Southeast Asian countries were in alliance with the West, and they saw China as a political threat. And in places where the Chinese formed significant minorities, places like Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and Thailand, depending on the political, persuasion of the government of the day, they had, at times very harsh, policies on the Chinese. And the other aspect, of course, is among the millions of Chinese in Southeast Asia, there have always been some Chinese minority members who were, politically inclined to the left. And in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Singapore, when those countries were struggling for political independence, when the left and right wings of our politics were contesting for power, the Chinese minority, unfortunately, at times was seen as sympathetic to the left. And it resulted in hundreds of thousands of Chinese, as some would claim, in Indonesia, perishing as a result of, suppressions of the Chinese. In the case of Singapore and Malaysia, a significant minority were subsequently sent back to China, either voluntarily or forcefully. So it complicated the overseas Chinese experience. And as a result, even until now, both the mainland Chinese government and the government in Taiwan are very cautious whenever, the subject of the Chinese in Southeast Asia is brought up, for fears that, they may upset, governments in Southeast Asia, and that, the Chinese minority in Southeast Asia is seen as a potential political, threat to the government of the day.
Now, let's talk about some of the benefits of return migration. Return to China's not always easy. There are some barriers which I'd like you to talk about, but there are also some facilitating factors. Basically, who returns and why?
In the past, in the case of the Chinese diaspora experience, the return was an experience associated with a life cycle. That, people wanted to return to the ancestral land in order to die. And it's a very Chinese concept because, the Chinese culture, partly perhaps Confucian, has always been a very land-based culture. When one dies, one, needs to be buried in the ancestral village. So, the longing to return was a life cycle stage experience. More recently, as a result of political and other considerations, at different points in Chinese history, governments were very keen to make use of what has been referred to as the diaspora option. That's to promote national development. You have this overseas asset, meaning people of your same ethnicity who have succeeded in life in other parts of the world, either becoming very wealthy or becoming very knowledgeable, in different professions. And they become a very useful, national asset in the promotion of our national development. So increasingly, both China and, other countries had at different points in time looked to their overseas compatriots as a resource for national development. And it's something that, the Chinese have done over the years. And more recently, countries like India and others have also been actively promoting the diaspora option. And it's very much part and parcel of, the globalization process.
Kee, I'm just really interested in your view. If we look at the Chinese diaspora as a story, you seem to be quite positive about the future.
I'm positive about the future with the Chinese diaspora experience, partly because of the trend and the characteristics of our globalization, and also, at another level, regionalization in the Southeast and East Asia, parts of the world. Increasingly, the Chinese, with their cultural heritage, meaning their language, their Chinese language skills, their knowledge about the Chinese, society, Chinese economy, those attributes are increasingly regarded as an asset. As countries in Southeast Asia, where the majority of Chinese are located, as they attempt to negotiate their relationships with an increasingly influential China, as they attempt, to export more to China, as they attempt to attract more Chinese investment, the Chinese diaspora is increasingly being seen as an asset, as a bridge that, respective countries, economies could use as they attempt to relate to China.
Thank you so much, Professor Kee, for your time today.
Thank you.
I'm Jennfier Cook, and we've been talking to Professor Pookong Kee about the Chinese diaspora. Relevant links, a full transcript and more info on this episode can be found at our website at upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Up Close is a production of the University of Melbourne, Australia. This episode was recorded on the 5th of July 2011, and our producers were Kelvin Parham and Eric Van Bemmel. Audio engineering is by Gavin Neighbour. Up Close is created by Eric Van Bemmel and Kelvin Parham. Until next time, goodbye.
You've been listening to Up Close. For more information, visit upclose.unimelb.edu.au. Copyright 2011, the University of Melbourne.